the Alternative Investment Roundtable's monthly call. Alternative data is changing discretionary investment. Iackson of Miri Asset Securities USA. Very pleased to welcome Matej Zatrano of System 2, a leader in the burgeoning field of alternative data. Just by background, Matej founded System 2 to augment investment research with data and technology. Leverage the System 2 team, an on-demand task force with expertise in data science, engineering, and artificial intelligence to help them improve model estimates. He also hosts a community of investors who regularly discuss trends in data-driven investing. He spent 8 years at King Street Capital, where he started the Data Science Initiative. He holds a master's in math from Columbia University and BAs in psychology, math, government, and economics from Cornell University. Now, before I introduce Matej, I do want to thank and acknowledge our sponsor whose support makes this all possible. We have Alston Bird, Mellon, Baker, Bloomberg, and Thornton, New Capital, for Systems, and so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matej. Hey, how are you today?
Doing for you.
I'm doing fine. It's a Friday. Always like Fridays. And as I said to you earlier today, Murray just sponsored recently the Global Fund Forum over at the Warner Building, and we covered, or I should say, put together a panel that looked at this topic, and I listened with great interest, knowing that I was about to have a call with you this week. So I think we're all excited to hear about trends in this field and how it relates to our respective investment management businesses. So why don't we dive right into the questions? And I think the first question that we'd like to ask you is, what's the traditional definition of alternative data, and what's alternative data mean today? How has it changed over the years?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that we looked at this, so my background, as you mentioned, was at King Street, which is a very fundamental hedge fund that invests in a lot of distressed credit and other things. And so when we started looking at incorporating our alternative data into that investment process, it was still with a bent towards understanding the fundamentals of companies, but being able to do so on a much more granular level. And so the typical investment process entailed looking at company report information from companies, listening on earnings calls, looking at the 10Ks and Qs, obviously following the news, having management conversations, and you would form a picture of what's happening. Historically, people were definitely using different kinds of information to get at insights. Had the emergence of expert networks, for example, in the late 90s, early 2000s, that provided investors with an opportunity to get deeper into companies. The ones that were leveraging those new information streams obviously were able to profit from that. Had people doing challenge checks for a while to understand how what the pipelines of sales and orders are for various companies. But the emergence of these newer technologies, whether it's better sensor equipment or just different companies that are storing data in their databases as part of their normal operations, has enabled us to do research on companies on a whole nother level. And so when you think about what alternative data means today, it's often people like to ask, how many alternative data providers are there? And you have various lists online in other places. Companies sell this kind of information as well, and they'll have, a couple of hundred, maybe even 1,000 different companies that are selling data actively into the market. You see a huge number. Even when I started this at King Street a number of years ago, there were some providers that were already selling information, but it wasn't that widely known about. For example, credit card data has been one of the earlier data sets that enabled investors, especially on those covering consumer retail, to understand trends in the retailers before the retailers reported. And so those data sets existed, but today I don't, even though 1,000 data providers seems like that, the reality is that that number is much, much larger. And when people ask me that question, is like, what is alternative data? Honestly, it's anything. Any company that stores data in their database or their normal operations, that owns that data and has the right to resell it, is a potential data provider. And so if we're going into a new sector or a new company that we've never seen before, maybe they're using, that we're trying to measure that company, the target company, maybe they're using some software from an invoice provider. And that invoice provider actually owns the data that's being sent to them. And we can then look across all the invoices that invoice provider processes, and we can get a sense of what the sales are of a bunch of B2B companies. So the definition of alternative data is basically very it's unlimited. It's how creative you can be, what kind of relationships or companies you can come across that might have access to data sets that can help you as part of your investment process.
And that sounds all very exciting, and I'm sure it's dynamic. Question to you, how come we're, though, of the quality of that data, number one, and number two, what are standards for data, right? I mean, the averages. How do we know that we're using similar units of measurement, so to speak, from a qualitative standpoint?
That's the bulk of the work that we end up doing, is figuring out what does this data tell us, what's the quality of it, and more importantly, the reality is that no matter what SAIL will tell you, every single data set is flawed. And the only way you can do something with it is by actually trying to understand where those flaws are and what you can do to alleviate them. And so the first step that we like to take whenever we're putting a data set is not even so. I mean, one way to do it might be to run a back test on that data set versus a stock price or versus the thing that you're trying to measure. But in view, that is not a great way to start that problem, because you don't understand why that correlation might exist in the first place. You might come across, like if you test, especially given the magnitude of the available data sets that I mentioned, you might be able to test thousands of them in various combinations, and you'll end up with certain things that look like they might be correlated, but in fact they're just spurious correlations. And so from the point, we want to dive deep into each set and understand the fundamental collection methodology behind that data and understand what might go wrong there. So to give some examples, if you're looking at, let's say, mobile data, and I'll just give a quick overview of the different kinds of data sets that are more popular today. Data sets, like I mentioned, on the credit card side, where we have a panel of people that are being tracked on a daily basis, and they look at how much spending has occurred across those people to the various retailers. You have data sets that look at that can track cell phones. So a lot of us use apps on our phones that collect our location. Odds are you didn't pay for that app, and they need to make money somehow, and increasingly they're making money by selling your information. And so these are things that a couple of years ago only the NSA had access to, but now they're available for purchase. So we can read people's credit card statements, track their cell phones. You can read people's emails. There are of apps that collect email information for various purposes, but ultimately they show the number of purchases. So they look at the email receipts that are hitting your inbox, and they're looking to see what items you're purchasing from those stores. There are tons and tons of other data sets that focus on healthcare, that focus on energy companies, And so whenever we're trying to understand the quality of any one of these data sets, we want to understand that collection methodology. So what does it mean when you're taking data off a cell phone? I mean, it sounds great in theory. We all understand that we open up maps and we can see exactly where we are at any point in time. And so, theoretically, you should have this great granularity on the location, and you should be able to track the person wherever they go. And it sounds kind of assessment standpoint, maybe a little bit scary from a privacy standpoint, but the reality is that that couldn't be further from the truth. The quality of so if you think about how the data is collected in various apps, like your phone is not pinging your location all the time. Depending on the app, apps only allow you to, they're only collecting location while the app is open. So this is something like a weather app. When you open it in the morning, they take location, they see where you are. But then other apps, so for that user, I'll only see you once a day in one location, and that's probably not going to be interesting to me because you're often home, and I don't care about where you live. I care about which stores you're visiting and how the traffic to those stores are changing. And so by understanding the limitations that the different apps have in their ability to collect the location and what the operating system imposes on them, because there are a lot of restrictions that come straight from the operating system, enable us to figure out how this data is going to be skewed. And in particular, in this example, and in a lot of the examples, you have a lot of churn. So you're going to have people that are coming into and out of this panel on a regular basis. And so figuring out ways of addressing that churn and figuring out whether the people that left are simply people that joined. So demographics, if for you lost a ton of teachers, but you gained a lot of middle-aged women in central United States, if you don't actually know that, all you know is that you're seeing the net number of devices that you're tracking stay the same on a month-over-month basis. But if you didn't understand this demographic shift that happened, the trends that you're going to see in terms of the visitations to the stores or the malls that you care about are going to be very different. And so, I mean, I can actually go into a lot of these in more detail, but on a high level, just get a sense of how complex the question of understanding the data quality can be.
So, as you said earlier, it sounds like, I mean, everything can constitute data. So there's infinite possibilities in terms of what can be considered. So I guess a question then would be, what process for implementing an alternative data framework would begin?
With the issue that the analyst is trying to solve around their company. There are, obviously, if you're coming at this from a more quantitative standpoint, that's more of a moot point. You're trying to find signals in all sorts of different data sets that can speak to a large number of names. Just given my background and my bias, we like to begin with a specific question. And those questions are increasingly becoming more granular. People are, instead of just looking at trying to predict top-line revenues, they are trying to now go deeper and understand how promotional a certain retailer is. How is a certain marketing campaign? We've talked to some advertisers recently, and one of the questions, or one of the things that they brought up when they heard that we come from the finance world, is just how surprised they are that when analysts listen in on earnings calls, they keep asking questions on whatever, inventories and various like top-line metrics. But some of the softer questions, like how is your marketing campaign performing? How are you able to retain different kinds of customers, and how much are you spending to retain those customers? And so
I was saying, to be effective at what you do obviously requires the skills of a data scientist, right? But do you need to have an understanding of the application? Do you need to understand the markets?
Yeah, I mean, so the unfortunate answer is that to be good at this, you need to know a little bit about everything, and hopefully more than just a little bit. And so you absolutely need to have context in terms of investing, because we often see examples of PhDs in some quantitative field that get brought in to work on these kinds of problems, and they start working on something. Maybe they'll come across some really cool thing, some new machine learning algorithm they'd love to implement, and they do some really cool academic thing, but it turns out that doesn't matter for how this stock trades. So having as to what actually matters for a company. Because just because you can measure revenues doesn't mean that that's the big question mark. And there are a lot of companies or a lot of like or channels where the revenues are more consistent, but the question is around something else. Maybe it's around profit margins. Maybe it's around competition breaking in. And so you absolutely need to have that kind of a context. But beyond just the technical nature and the financial background, we're increasingly seeing that you need to have context in also other industries, whether it's ad tech. Advertising is a huge component of any retailer's expenditures. So, and not just that, but they're also, it's the mechanism through which you can acquire future revenue. So understanding the effectiveness of advertising is crucial. And advertising is a whole like beast on its own. They have an entire ecosystem that is very technical. They have exchanges where the ads that you're getting served on your mobile phone or on your browser get traded on, so people can bid on these different ad inventories. And another example of the breadth of knowledge that you need to have, we recently were talking to someone in DC that have a data company that focuses on predicting elections, like the midterms, and also understanding what impact that will have on legislation.
Well,
and again,
I'm wondering, what about weather patterns?
Exactly. So if you, for a lot of, if you're looking at energy, even retail, I mean, weather patterns play a big role, even in the election. Trying to forecast voter turnouts is impacted by the weather. So, and each one of these things on its own, right? Because if you're saying, okay, if there makes a difference in terms of how many people come to my store, maybe the store is a little bit less